Joining me now, history professor and author of Obama's America, a transformative vision of our national identity, Ian Reifowitz. Ian, hi, good to see you.
Good to see you. Glad your voice is back to normal.
Yeah, just about back to normal. Still a little hoarse, a little bit of coughing, but mostly not as much struggling this week. Ian, let me ask you. To me, this seemed pretty disrespectful. Like I said in the introduction, it's mind-boggling to me that people, regardless of your ideology, can't put partisan politics aside for 2 minutes to honor the wife of one of our military members who laid down his life. And I wanted to get your opinion on this. I mean, how could they do that? How could they suggest that this woman, who is in such an enormous amount of pain, was just a pawn of the president to get ratings?
Well, first of all, let me say that Mrs. Owens is an amazing woman, and what she's gone through, I can't even imagine how I would feel going through that situation. I think that's the first thing I want to say. I did listen to what Michael Moore and Bill Maher said on Chris Matthews. I'm assuming that's where you're looking at. I thought that Bill Maher was inappropriate. He did have some negative things to say, slightly, small negative things to say, but still inappropriate ones about Mrs. Owens. I believe he said, "I wished she hadn't allowed herself to be used as a pawn," or something like that. To me, I don't look. If the president of the United States calls and you've lost your spouse, and the president says, "Please come here and sit in the gallery," you do it.
Right.
I don't have any question about her motivations whatsoever. Michael Moore, I didn't hear Michael Moore actually criticize Mrs. Owens at all. I only heard him criticize the president. And most of Maher's criticisms were aimed at the president as well. But any criticism of
right.
Mrs. Owens
To me, it seemed disrespectful. It seemed disrespectful, first of all, to insinuate that honoring one of our fallen warriors, even in regards to President Trump inviting her there, that was a move just for ratings. I mean, at the end of the day, the president of the United States, politics aside, he's the commander-in-chief of our military. He's responsible for the lives of these men and women, and particularly responsible for the families of the fallen warriors. I mean, whether it was President Obama during his 8 years as a Democrat or President Trump now, I mean, for goodness sake, let's put politics aside and just honor these people, because it's not about whether we agree with the motivation. It's the fact that they were willing to give their all in what the commander-in-chief thought was necessary for our freedom. But Ian, let me ask you, this speech as a whole, besides these minor controversies, it was mostly viewed in a positive manner. I think 78% of viewers viewed it positive, and that includes 58% of Democrats. What'd you make of it?
Well, you have to remember, and we look at this with every presidential speech. First of all, the audience of a presidential speech is a self-selecting audience for the most part. If you looked at comparative ratings to President Obama's first speech in 2009, that was received more positively. But that aside, the Trump speech was received relatively positively. I don't think, in some ways, he's being judged in the same way that previous presidents, whether Bush or Obama, have been judged. I mean, this is somebody who he's judged by a different standard. It's almost as if he doesn't light the building on fire, he gets points just for that. So I think at some point he will have to be judged by the standard of other presidents. He stood up, he read a speech that was written for him, he did a fine job in reading it. But in terms of the actual content, if you notice, there were some comments from White House staffers that they were surprised at the positive reaction. One White House staffer told a Bloomberg reporter, and this is a quote, the speech was quote, "white nationalism in an indoor voice."
Right, and I actually wanted to ask you about that. Someone else said that, I think it was Tom Perez, the new head of the Democratic Party, he said that Trump's joint address was Steve Bannon on steroids. And Ian, I mean, I talked to Democrats on the show yesterday. I don't understand where that's coming from. I mean, the most polarizing issues between Democrats and Republicans would be welfare reform, would be abortion, would be, some of these more social issues, or scaling back the size and scope of government, or how much we spend. He didn't talk about those things. I mean, the issues that he talked about in this speech last night, I mean, are issues that I think you and I even agree on. We need to reform our inner cities. We need some sort of infrastructure investment here, although my guess is we actually are flip-flopped here, that you agree more with President Trump on that than I do. I mean, he talked about enforcing immigration, banning lobbyists, unemployment rates. The stuff he talked about was pretty bipartisan.
Well, the things that I think probably what Perez is talking about, and the things that I focused on when I was listening to the speech, was some of the rhetoric around crime. These are not especially important. Important is the wrong word. These are not policy issues where the federal government can have a major impact. Crime is, relatively speaking, a local issue. But when the president talked about crime, and especially immigration, he talked about creating this office called Voice. And I did some research on this, and the purpose of the Voice office essentially is to put out a report, a report every week highlighting individual crimes committed by immigrants. At one point, he mentioned in one part of the document, it mentioned undocumented immigrants. Another part of the document, it mentioned immigrants as a whole. And the other point was to make a monthly report about crimes committed by immigrants. Given that immigrants commit a lower rate of crimes than the native population, that's true both
Well,
for
illegal immigrants don't commit a lower rate of crime. They commit, I think, 3 times as much. I mean, illegal immigrants are something like 3% of our population, but they're upwards towards 15 or 20% of violent crimes in some areas. And I think that's very interesting that you bring that up, because to me, this is a bipartisan or a nonpartisan issue too. I mean, when we're talking about people who have entered our country illegally, and you and I before have differentiated between the two groups of criminal aliens, people who enter illegally and then go on to commit crimes, even violent crimes, and then people who enter our country illegally and then lead otherwise law-abiding lives. I mean, you and I have differentiated between that. I think the policy should be very different. I don't know that there's anybody on either side of the aisle who disagrees with the idea that we should be deporting criminal aliens.
I don't. I think you're right about that, but that's not something that he was talking. When he was talking in the speech, he was talking about using this office to stigmatize a group of people. And I did research on this because I wrote about this in my column. In fact, even undocumented immigrants are in a sense are underrepresented among violent criminals. It's both undocumented and immigrants across the board. But the statistics aside, what is the purpose of essentially publishing a list of crimes committed by a group of people? He talked about how this would give a voice to the victims of crime. If they've already been victimized by crime, how does it help them to put the name of the person out there who's been captured and presumably is on the way to being deported?
Well, I mean, I think the answer. I do think the answer to that is pretty obvious, and we'll have to save the statistics talk for another day. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I do know that the rate is significantly greater proportion than the percentage of illegal immigrants that are in our country. Like I said, I believe it's something like 3% to 15 to 20%, but I'd have to get the exact bulleted list of individual crimes here. But I think the point of bringing this to light is preventing it from happening again. I mean, you and I, again, have talked about Kate Steinle, the girl, in her 20s in San Francisco, who was killed by an illegal immigrant who'd been deported 5 other times. I mean, this is to bring to light this system of sanctuary cities that provides sanctuary, hence the name, to people who've committed crimes who shouldn't even be in our nation in the first place. I mean, it's like President Trump said, I guess, what would you say to these American families who've lost people, who've had their children, their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, their sisters murdered or raped or kidnapped or assaulted, the victim of violent crime, but we're not changing the system to prevent these people from being in? People need to know about that, because that's not what they think of when they think of sanctuary cities.
I think we can agree that this is an issue that has to be dealt with properly and seriously. Without, we'll put it this way, presidents have a limited amount of time when they're speaking to the nation, and it's certainly a limited amount of time in an annual address to Congress. To spend so much time talking about immigrants and crime, and not even mention anything positive about immigrants, is part of a larger strategy, which is why that White House official talked about white nationalism, of ginning up fear of immigrants, ginning up fear of people who don't look like you. We have anti-immigrant
right.
sentiment.
No, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I don't agree with it. I think that's looking at it through a lens, trying to interpret it in that way. I mean, like I said, I don't know anyone on either side of the aisle who has a problem with, looking at crime from whence it stems, whether it's, inner city crime in Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, or whether it is illegal immigrants, any sector of the population or place geographically where it's higher. We look at that to see why it is so that we can stop it. Ian, we're out of time for today. Thanks so much for being here.